Alright, here we go. Number 8. Lamprey Pie. In December 1135, King Henry I of England died at his hunting lodge in Saint-Denis-en-Lyons, Normandy. The medieval chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, writing in his Historia Anglorum around 1154, recorded the cause of death as a surfeit of lampreys. Henry had eaten too many of his favorite dish, and according to later accounts, his physicians had already warned him to stop. He ignored them. The lamprey finished the argument. To understand why this is disturbing, you need to understand what a lamprey actually is. It is not a fish in any conventional sense. It is a jawless parasitic creature that attaches itself to living host fish, using a circular toothed suction disc, boring into the flesh and drinking blood and bodily fluids for months at a time. It spends its larval years, sometimes as many as 7 of them, buried in river sediment, filter feeding from the contaminated murk of the riverbed. By the time it reaches the table, its fatty tissues have had years to accumulate environmental toxins and heavy metals from whatever waterway it called home. And yet the lamprey was the most coveted dish in the English royal court for over 3 centuries. The city of Gloucester was legally obligated to present the crown with a lamprey pie annually, a tradition so entrenched it was revived for Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953, and again for her Diamond Jubilee in 2012. Food historian Terence Scully, in his 1995 work, The Art of Cookery in the Middle Ages, documents the lamprey's prominence at royal feasts across England and France. The richer and fattier the flesh, the more prized the dish. Those qualities were also precisely what made it toxic. Medieval preparation involved long stewing in heavy wine and spices, which masked spoilage and disguised the pungent smell of a creature that had spent its life in contaminated sediment. The wine did nothing to reduce the toxin load concentrated in the flesh. It simply made the lamprey taste like something worth dying for. Henry I's physicians warned him. He ignored them. The lamprey, a parasitic creature that had spent its entire life drinking the blood of other animals, ultimately returned the favor. Number 7. Peacock Roast. At every great medieval banquet of the 13th and 14th centuries, the moment that silenced the hall was not the arrival of the boar or the roasted pig. It was the peacock, carried in on a platter, fully redressed in its own iridescent feathers, head gilded, beak painted gold, occasionally with a flame burning from its open mouth. It was the most visually spectacular dish in the history of European dining. It was also one of the most bacterially compromised foods ever served at a high table. The peacock's place at the feast is documented in some of the earliest surviving European cookbooks. Guillaume Tirel, known as Thai Levant, royal cook to Charles V and Charles de VI of France, included detailed peacock preparation in his Le Viandier, associated with the late 14th century. The technique, called endoring, involved skinning the bird whole with its feathers completely intact, roasting the bare carcass, and then sewing the feathered skin back on before service. The process could take hours. Bartholomeus Anglicus, writing in his Encyclopedia de Proprietatibus Rerum around 1240, noted that peacock flesh was considered nearly impossible to properly digest, described by multiple medieval sources as exceptionally tough and strongly flavored. Nobody seemed to connect the digestion problems with what was actually happening to the meat. What was happening was this. The refeathering process created near-perfect conditions for Clostridium perfringens and Salmonella. A warm, feathered skin held against cooling cooked meat for the duration of the feast provided the ideal environment for rapid bacterial multiplication. Peacocks kept in aristocratic menageries were fed on scraps from the same kitchen yards that processed other animal waste, elevating their pathogen load before the bird even reached the kitchen. The most revealing detail is this. The dish's value was entirely theatrical. Historian Bridget Ann Hinish, in her 1976 study, Fast and Feast, Food in Medieval Society, documents how the peacock functioned as a status performance rather than a culinary one. No one was there to eat it, not really. They were there to be seen at the table where it was served. When a dish exists purely to signal power rather than to be eaten, and its preparation creates optimal conditions for food poisoning, you have to ask what it says about a society that the more impressive the food looked, the more dangerous it had silently become. Number 6. Swan roast. By royal decree, every mute swan in open water in England belonged to the crown. This was not a tradition or a courtesy, it was law, formalized in the Statute of 1582 under Edward IV, and it remained enforceable for centuries. To be served roasted swan at a feast meant your host had connections reaching directly to the palace. It was one of the most powerful status signals in medieval English dining. It was also, in ways nobody at the high table could have understood, an invitation to consume a bird that had spent its life feeding from some of the most noxious waterways in the country. The swan appears in the form of Curie, the cookbook produced by Richard II master cooks around 1390, described as roasted whole and redressed in its feathers before service, essentially the same lethal preparation technique used for peacock. Mute swans, Cygnus oler, are bottom-feeding waterfowl. They consume aquatic vegetation and invertebrates pulled from riverbed sediment. In medieval England, the most productive swan habitat was the Thames and its tributaries, waterways that also served as the primary sewage disposal system for London and every town upstream. The river that produced the most prized birds was the same river into which the city emptied everything it wanted to forget. The contamination ran deeper than bacteria. Lead, cadmium, and other heavy metals accumulate in the tissues of bottom-feeding waterfowl over time. This was not a theoretical concern. By the 20th century, swan deaths from lead poisoning on the Thames had become severe enough to prompt the Control of Pollution Amendment Act of 1985, which banned lead fishing weights in English waterways. The birds had been absorbing the river's toxins for centuries. In medieval times, nobody was counting the cost. Medieval food accounts describe swan flesh as extraordinarily difficult to chew and strongly flavored, the kind of description that suggests the dining experience was more about endurance than pleasure. The refeathering process, identical to that used for peacock, added layers of bacterial contamination to flesh already saturated with whatever the Thames had deposited in the bird across its lifetime. The swan was a symbol of royal grace and noble power. What it actually was a bottom feeder from a sewage river, slow roasted and served wrapped in its own contaminated feathers to people who could be prosecuted for declining the honor. Number 5. Eel pie. The Domesday Book of 1086 records eel renders from dozens of manors across England with remarkable precision. The manor at Streatham in Cambridgeshire alone owed 3,750 eels annually to Ely Cathedral. These were not luxury goods. Eels were infrastructure, feeding monasteries through Lent, sustaining urban populations through winter, filling the markets of every town with access to a river. The city of London ate them constantly, in pies, stews, jellied, and smoked. What those Londoners were consuming in vast quantities was a creature whose blood contains a documented protein toxin and whose preparation, in medieval conditions, created near certain opportunities for that toxin to reach the table. European eels, anguilla, carry ichthyohemotoxin in their blood, a heat-label protein that causes severe poisoning if consumed raw or if preparation vessels are not properly cleaned between the bleeding and cooking stages. The toxin is destroyed by thorough cooking. In a medieval kitchen producing hundreds of eel pies for a large household, thorough cleaning of every surface and vessel between stages was not a realistic expectation. The physician Galen had documented eel blood toxicity in the 2nd century AD, and his works were the standard medical reference texts of medieval Europe. The knowledge existed. It was transmitted through the universities of Salerno, Bologna, and Paris. It sat in monastery libraries across England. Food historian C. Ann Wilson, in her 1973 work, Food and Drink in Britain, documents the absolute centrality of eels to the medieval London diet across every social class. Archaeological excavations of medieval waterfront sites in London, conducted by the Museum of London Archaeology, confirm massive and continuous eel consumption from the Roman period through the late medieval era. The demand was constant, the supply was industrial in scale, and the risk was encoded in texts that physicians read, but cooks did not. Medieval preparation of jellied eel involved brief boiling, followed by cold setting in the cooking liquid, brief. The margin between a safely prepared eel and a contaminated one was measured in minutes of heat exposure, in how thoroughly a knife had been rinsed, in whether the cook had wiped the cutting board between fish. When the medical knowledge to identify a danger exists but the cultural appetite for the food is too powerful to challenge, who bears responsibility for the deaths that follow? The physicians who could not communicate it clearly enough, the cooks who could not understand it, or the society that made it structurally impossible to change. Number 4. Salted herring. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the Scania market at Falsterbo, on the southern tip of what is now Sweden, was the largest herring market in northern Europe. Estimates suggest the market processed around 300,000 barrels of salted herring annually at its height, feeding the Hanseatic League's trading network from the Baltic coast to the English Channel. This was not trade in a luxury. This was the protein supply of a continent. Armies marched on salted herring. Monasteries survived Lent on it. Urban populations from Bergen to Bristol depended on barrels that had left Scania weeks or months earlier. And within those barrels, in conditions that the fishermen, merchants, and buyers had absolutely no framework to evaluate, the wrong batch could kill you with what remains the most acutely lethal biological toxin known to science. Improperly salted fish creates ideal anaerobic conditions for Clostridium botulinum, the bacterium that produces botulinum toxin. The estimated lethal dose is between 1 and 2 nanograms per kilogram of body weight. Medieval fish salting depended on salt quality and packing density, both of which were highly variable across different production sites and different seasons. Undersalting or inconsistent distribution through the barrel allowed anaerobic bacterial growth in the sealed, oxygen-free environment. The finished barrel looked identical to a safe one. The English crown recognized that spoiled fish was a persistent problem. Various sizes of fish, documented in English legal records from the 13th century onward, attempted to regulate the quality of fish sold in markets. Marianne Kowaleski, a medieval economic historian at Fordham University, has documented systematic fraud in the medieval fish trade, with sellers regularly relabeling and reselling stock of questionable quality to extend its marketability. Botulism causes descending paralysis and respiratory failure. In a medieval diagnostic framework built on humoral medicine and the 4 bodily fluids, these symptoms would have been attributed to a cold imbalance, to supernatural causes, or to the judgment of God. Nobody was going to trace the paralysis back to the barrel. Botulinum toxin remains the most acutely toxic substance known to science. Medieval Europe packaged it in barrels, traded it across an entire continent, and served it as a staple food to every social class from monks to monarchs. The Hanseatic League was, among other things, one of history's largest accidental poison distribution networks. Number 3. Fermented fish. Long before the Hanseatic herring barrels, Northern European communities had already developed a different and more precarious relationship with preserved fish. Archaeological excavations at the Viking Age settlement of Birka in Sweden and at Hedeby in what is now northern Germany have recovered fishbone deposits showing evidence of pit fermentation, fish buried in the ground with just enough salt to slow, but not stop, bacterial decomposition. The process produced something that lasted through winter. The Frost-Athing Law and the Gauis-Gulathing Law, Norwegian legal codes dating to approximately the 10th through 13th centuries, both include provisions about fish quality and trade, which tells you that the people who wrote those laws had already encountered enough bad fermented fish to consider it a legal problem worth codifying. The danger in fermented fish is precise and unforgiving. The fermentation process requires salt concentration high enough to inhibit putrefaction, but low enough to allow lactic acid fermentation. Get that balance wrong in either direction, and you either produce rotted fish, or, more lethally, you produce the anaerobic conditions in which Clostridium botulinum type E thrives. This is not a historical risk that has since been resolved. Type E botulism in improperly fermented Scandinavian fish is a documented medical problem that continues to appear in clinical literature. The modern version of these traditions, surströmming, the Swedish fermented Baltic herring, is produced under controlled industrial conditions specifically because uncontrolled fermentation produces dangerous outcomes. In medieval practice, there were no instruments to measure salt concentration. There was no thermometer to monitor fermentation temperature. There was no microbiology to explain what was happening inside a sealed vessel or a buried pit. The practitioners of fermented fish worked entirely from transmitted knowledge, from the handed-down experience of what smelled right, what looked right, what felt ready. A failed fermentation batch is visually and aromatically indistinguishable from a successful one. The toxin produced by Clostridium botulinum is colorless, odorless, and tasteless. Communities learned which batches were safe through trial and error. The error was frequently lethal, and it affected everyone who ate from the same vessel. In a society where the knowledge of whether food will kill you is held collectively and transmitted through practice rather than principle, what happens when one generation gets the ratio slightly wrong, and how many people share from the same batch before anyone realizes? Number 2. Blood pudding. On any slaughter day in a medieval English town, the scene was visceral and entirely ordinary. Animals were killed in the street in dedicated districts like the Shambles in York, one of the best preserved medieval butchers' streets in England, and the blood was collected in open vessels in the same yards where other waste accumulated. That blood, too valuable to discard, was mixed with fat, oats, barley, or breadcrumbs, stuffed into intestinal casings cleaned by hand in water drawn from the nearest river and cooked into blood pudding. Recipes appear in the form of curry, compiled around in 1390 by Richard de Saint-Ancon's Master Cooks, and in the French household manual Le Ménager de Paris, dated around 1393. Every culture had a version, everyone ate it, and the convergence of contamination pathways involved in making it was catastrophic in ways that nobody had the scientific framework to recognize. The pathogens associated with blood collected in open-air slaughter conditions include Yersinia enterocolitica, Escherichia coli O157H7, Salmonella, and Clostridium perfringens. Each of these alone represents a serious food safety hazard. But the most devastating risk came from a disease that was endemic in medieval European livestock and documented repeatedly in the historical record. Bacillus anthracis, the causative agent of anthrax, was present in cattle populations across England and the continent. The medieval chronicler Matthew Paris, writing in his Chronica Majora in the 13th century, documents repeated outbreaks of murrain, the medieval term for catastrophic livestock disease, sweeping through herds with lethal speed. Animals that fell ill were frequently slaughtered when they showed visible symptoms because a dead animal represented a total loss. That blood went into the pudding. Gastrointestinal anthrax, contracted by consuming meat or blood from an infected animal, carries a mortality rate of between 25 and 60% even with modern treatment. In medieval medicine, which had no concept of bacterial infection, the resulting deaths would have been attributed to a corrupt constitution, to bad air, or to the will of God. The intestinal casings used to contain the pudding were washed in the same rivers that received the yard's runoff. The pudding was eaten warm and communal, shared at the same table from the same dish. Medieval blood pudding was not simply a risky food, it was a systematic convergence of every possible contamination pathway available in a pre-microbial world: diseased animals, open-air collection, contaminated water, inadequate heat, and communal consumption, each one dangerous alone, and together creating conditions that killed people on slaughter days across medieval Europe with a regularity so consistent it was simply accepted as the natural order of things. Each of those deaths was invisible, absorbed into the ordinary rhythm of medieval mortality, and that invisibility is what makes what comes next so much harder to accept. Number 1, old cheese. Of all the foods on this list, old cheese seems the least threatening. It was not dramatic or ceremonial. It was not made from blood or parasitic creatures. It was simply cheese, aged, hard, crumbling, and completely ordinary across every level of medieval society. Monks aged it in cellar vaults. Peasants buried it in bogs. Merchants traded it across regional markets at fairs, documented from the 8th century onward in monastic records, from abbeys including Citeaux in Burgundy, and in the records of Gloucester's cheese trade. The London Assize of 1363 included provisions against the selling of corrupt cheese, and 13th century Parisian guild records document cheese inspectors, called jurés, authorized to seize stock deemed unfit for sale. Both facts mean the same thing. Dangerously contaminated cheese was common enough, persistent enough, and recognizable enough to require formal legal intervention. And still, the cheese kept killing people because the medieval world had no way to understand what was inside it. What was inside it, depending on the batch, the cellar, the season, and the raw milk used, was a rotating roster of biological hazards. Aspergillus flavus and Aspergillus parasiticus, molds that thrive in the warm, humid conditions of an uncontrolled medieval cheese cellar, produce aflatoxins, among the most potent. Naturally occurring carcinogens and hepatotoxins, known to science, capable of causing acute liver failure at high doses with prolonged exposure. Listeria monocytogenes, cold tolerant and particularly suited to the cool, damp environments where hard cheeses were stored, causes listeriosis, a condition with a mortality rate of 20 to 30%, even with modern antibiotic treatment. Raw milk, the only kind available before pasteurization, carried Mycobacterium bovis, the agent of bovine tuberculosis, and Brucella species causing brucellosis, both documented epidemic diseases of the medieval period whose connection to dairy was not established until the 19th century. Then there is the most disturbing layer. Paul Kinstedt, in his 2012 academic history, Cheese and Culture, documents the complexity of microbial activity in uncontrolled medieval cheese production. Historian Mary Matazian, in her 1989 Yale University Press study Poisons of the Past, makes a compelling and well-evidenced argument that ergot alkaloids produced by the fungus Claviceps purpurea, contaminating grain-based whey and cheese rinds, may explain a significant proportion of the medieval outbreaks known as ignis sacer, holy fire, episodes of mass gangrene, convulsive hallucination, and communal seizure that swept through villages without warning and without any cause the medieval world could identify. The ergot connection to medieval mass events is not a settled consensus, but the evidence Matosian assembles is substantial, and it points towards something profoundly unsettling. That some of the most terrifying and inexplicable disasters of the medieval period, the ones attributed to divine wrath or demonic possession, may have been quietly incubating in the most ordinary food in the cellar. Old cheese was not a luxury or a ritual. It was everywhere, in every season, eaten by every person from the abbot to the field worker, aged in conditions that nobody controlled and nobody could evaluate for safety. The great unexplained fevers, the convulsions, the episodes of communal madness that have fascinated historians for centuries, they have been attributed to plague, to spiritual crisis, to the darkness of the medieval mind. Some of them may have been sitting on a shelf in a wheel of old cheese, waiting to be cut open. We did not know enough then to look, and the medieval world did not know enough to look away. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.